The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. This is Jackie Jacobs. I am the Family Engagement Specialist with the Phelan-McDermid Syndrome Foundation. We are going to get started in about 2 minutes. I just want to give a couple of minutes for any remaining folks who want to join in. So we are going to put ourselves on mute and come back at you in about 2 minutes. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So again, I am Jackie Jacobs, and I am the Family Engagement Specialist for the Phelan-McDermid Syndrome Foundation. Welcome to Registry 201, from the registry to the researcher. I'm really excited to be part of this webinar. We've had Registry 101 in the past, where we talk about some registry basics, but we wanted to use this webinar to go into a little more detail and really go beyond the basics. For anyone new to the registry or new to the foundation, the first few minutes we will go back through those basics. We want to get everyone up to speed and on the same page, but once that's covered, the content will really go into what happens once your data is in the registry, how it's being cleaned, and avenues for it being used during research. So we have two amazing panelists that will be presenting today. First, on the left of your screen, you should see we'll have Rebecca Davis, who's our Registry Coordinator for the Phelan-McDermid Syndrome International Registry. She joined the PMSIR team in 2014 as the Data Network Specialist. Her role is to take care of your data. She reviews the genetic information to make sure that it's entered into the registry accurately. She helps to create the policies that protect you and your data, and she reviews the requests from researchers who want to access your data. And this is what she's going to go into more detail about this evening. Before she joined the registry team, she was a clinical genetic counselor at the Cleveland Clinic Foundation in Cleveland, Ohio. She received her Master's of Science in Genetic Counseling from Arcadia University in 2011. Our second presenter, who you'll see on the right, is Kim Lant. She is mom to a 7-year-old boy, Will, with PMS, and a 10-year-old girl, Emily, who's an awesome big sister. She's married to Keith, who's an awesome dad to their kids. She has done a lot of volunteer work for the foundation and for the registry. She's been a McPosium facilitator during our 2016 PMSF Family Conference. She currently volunteers to the foundation as a member of the PAC, the Parent Action Committee, as well as the Research Review Committee, which she is going to discuss with you this evening. She is professionally a scientist and a project manager in research and development for an oil service company. So we're really excited to have their expertise as we go through the presentations. So just before I hand this over, two housekeeping items. There should be available on your platform the chat and questions feature, so you can certainly chat with us, ask questions that we will take towards the end. And we are also going to be recording this and posting it online. So I know we've gotten a couple of questions. That will be on the YouTube page for the foundation, so you'll be able to access that. So just an overview of what we're going to talk about today. The introduction, I just gave you a little introduction. Rebecca is going to walk through those basics, and she's going to really get into the journey of our data. So how it gets entered, what happens to it once it's in the registry, and then what it means to pull data out. We're going to get Kim to discuss the parent reviewer experience, and then we are going to open it up for questions. So with that, I will hand this over to Rebecca to get us started.
Great, thank you, Jackie, and hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Jackie and I have been talking about wanting to do this webinar for a long time, and we are very, very excited to be with you and to pull all this together and hopefully answer some questions, and maybe even answer some questions that you didn't even know you had. So to get us started again with the basics of the registry, and just as a reminder, PMSIR and the registry are really used interchangeably. We define ourselves as both a registry and a database. And the reason is that a registry really implies a contact-based platform. So collecting names and contact information for the purpose of connecting and communicating within a group of people. As most of you know, we do that. But we also have another layer, and that's the database, which is really the collection and the storage of clinical and genetic information for the purpose of research. So we really are both a registry and a database. We're all online, of course. And the purpose of the registry is to help move translational research forward. And what that means is we want to help scientists go from those basic research studies in a lab at a bench, maybe with the pipette, looking at proteins and gene function and what seems like really nitty-gritty basic science. And by basic, I don't mean simple, but the foundational research, and move that into an area where it can be used to create meaningful therapies and medications and really in-depth knowledge about a whole disease, which can involve many, many systems. And so we also call this bench to bedside research. And so that's the underlying motivation of this registry and database. Of course, a part of that is making sure that we're properly defining and understanding what is PMS. As many of you know, there's a wide spectrum of symptoms that are experienced by people with Phelan-McDermid, of severity, of onset, and certainly from the genetic standpoint, there's a good bit of variation in what that genotype is, what the genetic change is that seems to cause PMS. And so we want to continue to make sure we are defining that as accurately and completely as possible. And as we learn more, sometimes it feels like it gets more complicated, but we really want to be able to support that level of research. In the end, of course, the entire goal is to improve care and improve the care decisions that parents and caregivers make with the doctors and the other healthcare providers. We also want to help researchers identify and address the most important questions and challenges that our community faces. And in order to do that, part of that role is recruiting for research studies. And so we're going to talk about recruitment for research as well in a bit. So what's in the registry? As most of you probably already know, again, this is the basics. We collect demographic data, name, geographical location, age, race, gender, points like that, as well as clinical data and genetic data. So within the clinical data, we of course have our three core questionnaires: the clinical questionnaire, the developmental questionnaire, the adult and adult issues questionnaire, and those really are the backbone of our database. And then we also have some special projects as well, and you'll see the 6 that are currently available listed here. that previously were initially posted by a researcher who came to us and said, I'd like to post these surveys and collect data from your community. What we did was we did post those, and they were able to go on and publish based on that data. And then after a certain amount of time, they basically rolled over into our ownership. And so now we get to continue to collect and use that data as well. So it was a great deal between the two groups. And then, of course, genetic data, which we're going to talk about in a lot more detail. So obviously, we are giving this presentation in March 2018. So I wanted to give you some basic numbers as of today. If anyone is watching this webinar in a year from now, these numbers will no longer be accurate. They will only get better. But I wanted to give you a little bit of background here, a little breakdown of where we currently stand. So there are 1,159 members of the registry as of last week when I pulled this data. 49% are female, 41% are male, and about 9.5% we actually don't know if they're male or female because those people have not completed their demographic information. About 47% of our members are in the United States and territories and represent 49 states and territories, while 43% of our members live outside of the United States. And in total, we represent 54 nations around the world. Again, about 9.5% are unknown because of that lack of information there. We do have a vast majority of our members identify as white, Caucasian, and non-Latinx, followed by the Latinx community and the Asian community, Black or African American individuals, and then much smaller numbers also of Native American Pacific Islander, and then other about 163 people. I do want to point out here that unfortunately right now, the platform does not support picking more than one race or ethnicity. And obviously, it's really important to honor and collect that data from people who identify as biracial or multiracial. And so that is something that we are hoping to make available in the future. So I just wanted to address that in case anybody has wondered about that, but it is something we are aware of that we need to improve. And it's a technical limitation right now, but we're hoping to get that resolved. So currently, we have about 42% almost of our members who have provided genetic data, that we have data available to work with, while about 58% of our members have not yet provided genetic data. And so I know we pester you all about this quite frequently, but I just wanted to include this briefly here to show that while we have a lot of really great data available, we can always have more and really round out this database. And so I would always encourage everyone to please upload their genetic report if you're willing and comfortable. If you have any questions, always feel free to contact me. But the more data we have, the more research we can facilitate and the more high quality research we can facilitate as well. Similarly, I wanted to show you where we stood on clinical data. And so currently we have a great number, 63% of our community have actually completed their clinical questionnaire at least once, and many, many have also completed other questionnaires as well. Another 28% have at least started the clinical questionnaire, but have not quite finished it. That's okay, you get back to it when you can. But this really makes up well over 90% of our members have submitted some kind of clinical data, which is really, really, really fantastic. And you're all to be congratulated because I know that's a long questionnaire and we really, really appreciate it. We do have about 8% of our members who have not yet started a questionnaire. That's okay, get to it when you can, but important to do nonetheless. Finally, the last thing that I pester you all about that I wanted to mention briefly was updating consent preferences. And so this, I just wanted to illustrate really why that's important. We can't and will not use your data until you tell us how you want it to be used. It is extremely important to us to make sure we are honoring your wishes and not doing anything that you are uncomfortable with in terms of data sharing or even recontacting you about research studies. And so that's why we push so hard on updating consent preferences, because we really want to be able to use the data you've worked so hard to provide And so right now we have just over 70% of our members who have updated those consent preferences, and therefore over 70% who have usable genetic data. So it's 819 people. That's fantastic. The other not quite 30% have not yet updated their preferences. And so we really have unusable data on about 340 people. I'll add the caveat that many of those people actually have not yet provided very much data, and so it's not an enormous amount of data that we temporarily can't get to, but we can get to it, we just can't use it, I should say. But it's still a good chunk, and I really want to just reiterate that if you have questions, if you have concerns, if you forgot your username and password, just reach out to me. I'd be happy to help you through all of that. We just really want to be able to both honor what you want done with your data and actually be able to use it to facilitate research. So in order to actually update your preferences, all you have to do is log in. On the main homepage, you'll see a place to put in your username and password. Again, I know most of you know this, but just as a quick reminder, it will automatically direct you once you log in to update your preferences if you haven't done that already. And so if you're able to log in and go complete a questionnaire or upload an attachment, then you've already done this and you don't need to worry about it. You will know if you haven't updated your preferences yet because it will force you to do so before you can access anything else. And if you've forgotten your username or password, no worries. There's a link right there on the login page where you can retrieve it or reset it. And if you have any additional trouble, you're always welcome to email me, and my email address, the coordinator email address, is on the website. Okay, so now to the more fun, interesting part around pulling back the curtain of what happens to your data once you've added it into the registry. What are we spending all of our time doing with this data? And I really want to talk about the journey that your data goes on. And it really starts with you. We don't have data except until you provide it to us. That's what makes this registry a patient-powered database. And our job, mine, Jackie's, Kristen, who is the other genetic counselor I work with, all of us are here to be stewards of your data and just to make sure that it's properly prepared and that it's properly monitored and protected, and all in order to make it available in as high quality way as possible to researchers so that they can both ethically and effectively learn more about Phelan-McDermid syndrome and therefore serve the Phelan-McDermid community. So there are 5 basic steps that your data goes through, from collections to data entry, completion, review, and sharing. And so that's the overarching theme here, but I'm going to break this down into sections by talking about each of the types of data. The clinical data, that arrow is meant to indicate that it really jumps from collection all the way to the sharing portion. It kind of skips these 3 intermediate steps, whereas demographic data goes from collection to a level of review before it's shared, but skips the entry and completion, and then genetic data runs all the way through. And this will make more sense as I go through each bit, but they each take a slightly different journey, but the genetic data follows this entire steps. So first is data collection. And so really you can think of it as 3 paths that data can take into the registry. The demographic data is the first, and that's what you enter immediately after you register in the first place. And you provide your name and your name, but also the patient's name, birthday, gender, etc. And so that's the first way we collect data on the patient. The next is by you completing questionnaires. We collect that clinical data by you filling out the clinical questionnaire, the developmental questionnaire, etc. And that can happen anytime. As you know, this is open any time of the day or night. It doesn't have to be immediately after you register for the PMSIR. We do encourage you to try to complete at least the clinical questionnaire annually, or at least after big events. Maybe it's every 2 or 3 years. Maybe it's after major developmental milestones. If something changes in the patient's medical history, that's a good time to recomplete it so we can collect that information as well and see how they're progressing and changing over time. And so that follows everything from their initial diagnosis through, what tests they took, what symptoms they experienced, and various developmental milestones. The third way we collect data is by asking you to upload files or attachments. Again, that can be done anytime as they're available or as you find time to do that. They can be genetic tests, but they can also be other medical records as well. And so these are the three ways in which we collect data, but it really all comes directly from you. So I've sprinkled in a few PSAs, public service announcements, and pro tips in here to make it a little bit not only more interesting perhaps, but also more helpful. So one thing that has changed in the last year and a half is that unfortunately you can no longer edit your questionnaire responses once you've completed that questionnaire. So as you're going through the clinical questionnaire, if you come to a question or even 10 that you don't know the answer to, in the past you could go ahead and finish the questionnaire, do everything you could, and then you could go back to those specific questions and update them. Unfortunately, that's not possible anymore once we did a big upgrade to the platform, and it is something we are trying to resolve. But in the meantime, if you come to a question you can't answer, either pause, step away, look up the answer, see if you can find out and answer it before moving on to the next page, or you can also exit the questionnaire and come back to it on a later date when you have found the answer to that question and then continue on. Or if you really want to, if you don't think there will be that many, or if that's not really an option, that's okay. You can move on and continue on through the questionnaire and go ahead and finish it if you want. Just make note of any questions that you need to go back and edit or update, and then you can email the coordinator, and either Kristen or myself will be able to update that answer for you exactly how you specify. And I know those are not ideal and doesn't make your life easier, and I sincerely apologize for that. It is something we're trying to work on, but the underlying reason that this happened was to help protect data from the technical standpoint. So another pro tip for questionnaires, when you are completing a questionnaire, sometimes you come across a question that allows you to type in a response, a free text response. We're asking you to help us protect your confidentiality by not including any names or other identifying information when you enter those responses. So please don't say Johnny had a seizure when he was 5 and then never again, and now he's 10. When you enter your child or your loved one's name or other identifying pieces of information like their birthday or what town you live in, we have to go back in and remove that because it gives the potential for violating your privacy. And so that's okay. That's part of our curation. That's part of why we do a review. But it's easier if that information is not there in the first place, and I would hate to miss something. And so we do go through it very carefully, but please don't put any confidential or identifying information in those free text responses. And finally, for the data collection section, when you upload an attachment, especially a genetic test result, please remember that you do have to label that document, and the default label is a consent form. And most people are not frequently uploading a consent form. It's usually a genetic test result or some other medical record. And so please do remember to change that attachment type to the closest fitting label, especially for genetic test results, because when you label it as a genetic test result, it puts up a flag to the coordinator that tells us, hey, look, there's a new test. It needs to be started through its own journey. And that's how we know to go look at it. And so if it's mislabeled, we don't see it. And so I do multiple times a year go through and check anything that's labeled a consent form to make sure that it's not actually a hiding genetic test. And so we will catch it, but it might take 2 or 3 extra months before I'm doing my next batch of checks. And so please do try to remember to label that correctly when you go through. Okay, so now to the genetic data entry portion. As I mentioned before, the clinical data skips this step, as does the demographic data. It skips this step as well. So the only data that the coordinators are manually entering is genetic data. And so I wanted to give the genetic data its own graphic of its life cycle because it is so much more detailed and we do spend so much more time on it. I'm going to spend a little more time talking about it today than the other types as well. So when you upload your genetic report and you label it as such, as I said, it creates a flag, and the coordinator knows to open the report and enter that data into a preset form with key data points that are the most important pieces of information to researchers and in order to complete that genetic profile. And so I've included here a screenshot of some fake data. This is not real. I'm not violating any privacy here at all. Of 3 lines of an example of what this data looks like. And so right now, this lives in an Excel sheet that we're able to enter all of the genetic data points, 1 row per patient, 1 line at a time. So we go through it very, very, very carefully. As you can see, the first person, for example, we've indicated that they had a karyotype done, they had an array done, they had what's called a FISH test done, they have not had any sequencing done. We also indicate whether or not the SHANK3 gene is involved or not, and what type of genetic abnormality was seen on that test. And then this actually extends to the right about 60 more columns. We collect up to 70 different variables in order to really have that super complete genetic profile. And then there are other categories here or columns here that are used for internal tracking. So we know where each patient is in that flow, that process of reviewing and entering that data. So all of this is meant to make sure that the data lives in a format that it is searchable and reviewable, and we are able to learn information about our community very quickly, but also allows researchers to have it in a format that it can be used in more complicated and complex statistical analysis. So as the coordinator, Kristen or myself, is entering this genetic data, we've sometimes come across missing data points. So perhaps that report doesn't include a piece of information that really would be helpful to completely understand that person's genetic profile. And so we take an additional step of completing that data where needed. And I want to take one step back and point out why this is a bit unique for genetic data, and we really don't do this for the other types of genetic data, or excuse me, the other types of data. So for demographic data, we do a basic level of review of that demographic data in the sense of we identify people who have not completed their demographics form, and we will send you an email and say, hey, this isn't done yet, please fill this out when you can. We also look for things that don't make sense. So nonsense birthdays, if someone has listed a birthday that occurs in the future, that's probably a mistake, and we ask them to fix that. Other times we find state and country inconsistencies. Perhaps it says that someone lives in Afghanistan, but I can tell from their address that they live in a US state. Afghanistan just is listed first in the countries list, and so sometimes that happens. And so we're able to do that level of review and completing that information to make sure it's accurate. Clinical data, we don't complete that for you. I'm not going to go in and answer a question for you in your questionnaire. We are a patient-powered database. It is not my role to answer on your behalf. You know best as you're completing that questionnaire. The only thing we do review and make any changes to is what I mentioned earlier, those free text responses, and making sure we're removing any pieces of identifying information and just replacing it with something like the word name in all capitals to replace an actual person's name. The genetic data, as I said, is unique, and we're going to talk about that some more in a minute. And then the file attachments, like I said, we also don't review line by line. We just try to identify any genetic tests that are hiding under a different label. But we do open, of course, all those genetic tests and go through them line by line in order to enter the genetic data. All right, so let's talk about the genetic data completion specifically. And here I've listed it as follow-up because usually it does involve reaching out to either the registrant, the parents or the caregiver, or the lab to fill in those missing data points. And so the reason this is sometimes necessary is all genetic reports are not formatted in exactly the same way, and they don't all include exactly the same information. Some we can look at and say, this is actually very patient-friendly and is everything a parent would want to know. But if you're a researcher who wants to know exactly which SNP microarray platform was used, what model and what chip was used. That's information that perhaps a parent doesn't need to be as concerned about, but a researcher does want to know to understand how that gene or how the chromosomes were analyzed. And so sometimes we need to pick up the phone and call a lab and say, I'm looking at a report from 2005 and it was, a SNP array. Can you just tell me what platform you were using? And that's pretty easy to do. And that's the type of follow-up and completion we might work on. Other times we might call a parent and say, it's mentioned in this array report that your child had a karyotype done, but I don't have that report uploaded. Would you mind uploading it for me or emailing it to me? And so those are the types of examples of where we might track down some of these missing data points. And again, it's always in the spirit of and for the intention of making sure that this data is complete and as accurate and as ready for research as possible. I'll also mention that occasionally you may get a request from us that includes asking if you would be comfortable signing a medical records release form that we can then go to the lab and ask for either a new copy of the report or maybe there's a page missing. And so usually we try to do that without putting any burden on you. We try to do all of this follow-up without putting burden on you, but the labs of course are protecting your privacy as well. And so occasionally we will ask for that records release form. Okay, now on to data review. So I'm going to focus again on the genetic data because, like I said, it's really the one that goes through every single one of these steps and we spend the most time reviewing in such great detail. And what this involves is actually two layers of review I'm going to mention. One is the coordinator reviews, our internal review of the spreadsheet to make sure everything is accurate. And then we also have an external consultant who reviews large quantities of de-identified data based on her own expertise that I'll mention as well. So going back to this example Excel sheet, once we have completed each line initially, we've filled in all the new data, we're able to sort and filter by each column. We're able to look for missing cells. Is there a data point that is empty that we accidentally skipped over that we need to go back and make sure we find out that piece of information? Is the data formatted correctly? As I said, this needs to often be fed into statistical analysis programs, and genetic data is complicated, and if it's not formatted in the standard manner, it can throw off that data. And so we need to make sure that it is very consistently and accurately formatted. And we also want to make sure that the data is consistent across all of the columns. So if in this initial summary section, we have indicated that someone had an array done, I want to make sure that farther to the right in the array section that all of those detailed portions of the array has been completed. And then once we have completed a nice big batch of the data, we will send it to our consultant reviewer, who is a geneticist who has very kindly volunteered her time and her expertise to review this data in a de-identified format, to look for errors and identify important questions and even follow-up that needs to be done. And so this is just another layer of making absolutely sure that this is as accurate and complete as possible. And so at minimum, the genetic data has 2 sets of qualified eyes on it and often has actually 3. All right, data sharing and recruitment. So there are really 2 phases to this. And the first is the application review, which Kim is going to talk about her experience as a parent reviewer in a moment. And then the second is the data sharing and actual recruitment. Okay, so the application review, and this will be from the coordinator perspective. I'm not going to step on Kim's toes. So there are 4 basic steps in the application review. One is collecting the application, and that is where a researcher contacts us and says, hey, I'm interested in this case, recruiting for my study from your participants, and how do I go about that? And so we send them this application form that we've put together for them to tell us who they are, what institution they're with, more details about their project, about their study. For example, if it's a recruitment request, we need to know where the study is located. If our patients would be required to travel to that study site? If so, is there any compensation that's offered? And then a summary of the entire study to make sure that it meets all the guidelines and criteria of a good study. We want to know about their publication strategy, how this study is going to be used to further general knowledge, and then also information about the principal investigator. So we make sure they are who they say they are and everything. All those boxes are checked off. The next thing that happens is that the coordinator, myself, conducts what we call a capacity review and an ethics review. So the capacity review is really just answering the question, do we have the information this researcher needs to complete their request? If it's data, do we have that data available on the topic that they're interested in? If it's a recruitment request, do we have enough patients who meet their basic criteria to actually participate in their study? Can we meet this request? If the answer is yes, then we move on to the impact and relevance review, which is where I take the application and all of the supplemental documents that they've provided and provide it to the parent review team, who's able to review all of those materials and determine whether the study will positively impact our knowledge of PMS and if the topic is a priority to the community and is relevant, to the community. And here I just want to show you briefly, this is the form that our reviewers use to work through each of these applications. And so the first couple of pages are a lot of the background overview of the study and the answering the capacity review. Do we have the information we need to answer this request? And then the next page walks us through a whole list of questions that they answer for themselves about whether they think this meets our organization's criteria. Are the results likely to contribute to disease knowledge of PMS? Is this a research topic of interest to our community? Are there any potential threats or risks to responding to this request? So we're also keeping a very close eye on, are we protecting our community as well? And finally, the decision and subsequent sharing if approved. And so the review team is able to either approve a study, approve with conditions, or deny the request. And sometimes we do come back to the researcher and say, we'd really like to support the study, but there are one or two things we would like to request that you change or consider changing, that we think it would significantly improve it. If the request is approved, then I would then facilitate the sharing or the recruitment, depending on the type of application it is. So I'm going to talk briefly about what that data sharing looks like. And so this is, again, just trying to pull back the curtain of what does it look like. When we talk about data sharing and giving researchers data, what does that really, really mean? And so what we would do is I would collect the eligibility or the criteria, in this case for data, the specific criteria for participation in a sense, like which of our patients do they want to see data on? And I would do that by logging into the registry, and there's a whole coordinator set of tools that I have access to. And so in this example, I've pretended that there's a researcher who would like to look at data on patients who are over 1 year old and have some kind of diagnosis of renal or kidney disease. And so you can see each of these lines here represents a search for each of those criteria. And then at the bottom, under where you see ID, first name, middle name, last name, it would generate a list of patients who meet those criteria. Of course, I've cut that out because that would be a violation of your privacy if I were to show you all the names. The next thing that I can do is then select which data set we want to share with them. And so in this example, if they want to know more about kidney disease, we would probably select the clinical questionnaire because that's where the majority of our questions about renal and kidney function are. And so I would select that clinical questionnaire, and then we would be able to select the individual data points. Which questions and subsequent answers do we want to share with this researcher? And so the next page I come to has two columns where we are able to select both demographic data points that we share. Again, this is de-identified data, so we would not be sharing name and birthday. We would be sharing gender, race, really basic information like that. and then which specific questions we want to include as well. And so in this right column, it extends much, much, much farther down, but this just shows you the initial list of questions that are included that we can select from. And finally, we are able to share that data. We then export those questions and answers into an Excel sheet that, again, contains no identifiable information. And we're able to share that file securely through a HIPAA-compliant file sharing network with that researcher directly. The genetic data, I just want to point out, is fundamentally the same process. That example was for clinical data, but the genetic data is shared in fundamentally exactly the same way. I also want to show you briefly how recruitment is done. So again, the researcher would provide us with a list of eligibility criteria, minimum criteria by which we would start off our search. We would do, let's use the same example, another search for who meets those basic criteria of being eligible. We would generate a list of patients below, but instead of clicking this export button, we would click create mailing in order to turn that search list into a mailing list. I would then create the mailing list in the registry, which would then appear in our admin site, which is where we're able to actually draft the message itself. So the email that you get saying you're eligible for the study and here are some of the details of the study, that is a pre-written recruitment letter that the researcher writes and is approved by their IRB at their institution and has been approved by us as well, that we enter into this draft and send it out to that mailing list, and that's what you see in your inbox. And so then I would send that email blast in coordination with the researcher, and then leave it up to you to decide if you want to reach out to that researcher or not to potentially participate or ask questions about participation. Okay, so that's how we share data with researchers. I also want to just touch very, very briefly before I turn it over to Kim on how we share information and data back with you. And so one way is to click this little red Adobe icon here. So you can click on in your profile on any of the questionnaires that you've completed, and you'll see this icon, and that will allow you to actually download a PDF of your clinical questionnaire and responses or whatever questionnaire that may be. And some people find that they like to fill all that out and have all this valuable data there and want to be able to share that back with their doctor or with their child's teacher or someone else as well. So that's one way you have access to your own data. And another is through the Explore function. And so most of you are probably familiar with this, but I just wanted to point out again that it exists and that once you complete a questionnaire, you're able to see the aggregate data on how other members of our community answer that same question. And the main thing I want to just mention just for an educational piece is making sure you keep context in mind and some of the limitations of this function. Just remember that while the Explore function is really interesting and can be very, very helpful in many ways, it has not been validated by statistics, by a researcher. We do not review these charts individually. They do not prove causation or even necessarily correlation. And so these are not to be taken as gospel. These are meant to show you the responses of the community, to help figure out what questions you need to ask of your doctor, of your or things to look out for in your child that may or may not be true for you. And so one example I want to touch on, and I'm sorry, Jackie, I've gone over time, is the question, has the patient ever ground his or her teeth? And we see that a large number, about 425 people answered yes during the day, and another almost 300 have answered yes during the night, while almost 150 said no, and another 75 or so said that they were not sure. That's interesting, and that may be something that you would then want to go to your child's dentist and say, hey, you know, I just saw this on this function on this registry. Is there anything we need to think about as my child's teeth start coming in? Do we need to think about mouth guards or keeping an eye on their teeth to make sure they're not doing any damage? That's a really fantastic use of this kind of information, but it does not prove that all children with Phelan-McDermid syndrome grind their teeth or have significant bad outcomes because of grouting the teeth in terms of damage to their teeth. Just remember that when I look at all of these yes responses, I don't know how many of these people who answered the question have a 3-month-old baby, and so of course they don't grind their teeth, or versus how many have a 30-year-old who that information is more valuable if they answered no. So I just want to make sure that everybody keeps in mind that that context is important and that these are not, not research validated questions. So that is my overview of the journey of your data. I hope it was helpful for you. And now I'll finally hand it over to Jackie to start our parent reviewer experience discussion. Thank you, everyone.
Great. Thanks so much, Rebecca. That was fantastic. So now we are going to have Kim Lant. I'm going to ask her to, the way we're going to do this for the remaining portion is make this more of an interview style. So I have a couple questions that I'm going to ask Kim and ask her to answer those, but I also want to invite you all to ask questions. So once I get through mine, we'll go to yours, or if yours are more interesting, we'll go there. So please feel free to either in the chat or question section, go ahead and type in any questions you have either for Rebecca or Kim. So just to get started, Kim, can you just give us the 30-second story of your and Will's journey?
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you for having me, and everyone on the webinar, thanks for joining. A little bit of background about us. Will, our 7-year-old, has PMS, but we knew something was wrong very early on, but we didn't know what. And I know that you all probably have had similar journeys, especially as symptoms arose and you just started treating them and we just figured it out as we went along. I know that's a very familiar story. But we took a tortuous path to get to the diagnosis. At least 5 CMAs that I can remember, a whole genome study, plus the parental blood samples and 1 fish. Our suspects over the course of a couple of years were congenital myasthenia, which we actively treated with an available medication for nearly a year, Prader-Willi, Williams, Angelman's, Charcot-Marie Tooth, Ehlers-Danlos, and then that SC4NA gene, which was part of the congenital myasthenia. Turned out that I gave that to him, and I can't, it was just a misspelling, because if I had it, then I would be in the same condition he was, and I was not, obviously. So back to the CMA board we went, and that final CMA turned out to show a 2.644 megabase pair deletion on 22q13, including SHANK3. And it was an unbalanced translocation that was the interesting part of this. It was a 7.9 megabase pair an extra on 12p13. So we have only half the story, but it's a good half. The geneticist that we met with just said, hey, you know what? Here's what it is. It's called Phelan-McDermid syndrome, and there's a conference this summer, and you should go. And that was our introduction. And here we are.
And here we are. So the first question I have for you in the context of what Rebecca presented is, you are a parent volunteer on the Research Review Committee. So can you just tell us a little bit how you came to join? And I suspect if Rebecca changes to the next image, it'll give a great sense of kind of your experience about that.
Right. So the image on the left was me for the first 2 years, until 2016 or so. 2016, we finally kind of felt comfortable with it. But the geneticist told us go to the 2014 family conference, and we went, and we just got an incredible amount of information and met an incredible amount of people. But there was quite a bit of talk at that point about the registry and all of the efforts that were going into creating it, getting funding for it, getting it off the ground and getting it rolling. And you all were handling and balancing all that effort quite beautifully. But there was also much discussion about bringing in other eyes, ears, and minds to do the reviews. And the parent community was a great resource to tap. We parents obviously have a vested interest, and we're the most educated about our kids. And we care the most about the outcomes that we'd like to see happen for them. I liked the idea of volunteering, and there were lots of requests for volunteers, so I signed up without any commitment to anything. Just sign me up. I'll do whatever you need to. Megan O'Boyle contacted me, and over several discussions via phone and email, I landed on the PAC as well as the Research Review Committee. And I thought it was going to be a pretty simple process, but it was not, as it turns out. I had to submit a letter of support indicating what my intentions were, and a complete bio sketch to apply as a family partner to PCORI, which is the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, in order to pass the inspection to be a reviewer. And thank goodness I passed, because it's been quite an adventure since then.
Excellent. Sorry, I keep muting myself to give you
Oh.
space, and then it takes too long. So what do you do as part of the Research Review Committee? What's your role?
So as Rebecca explained earlier, the researcher applications are initially vetted before they come to us. And it's a pretty rigorous process that they have to get through to even get to us. Those strict requirements must be met before they can be passed along to us. And depending on the type of request, it could be a simple review of their application and a few questions back and forth between the reviewers. You know, do you know this person? Have we had any experience with them before? Do you know what their intentions are? Does this look like a legitimate request? Do they just want to see clean data? You know, is this level 1, so to speak, which is the easiest to vet? Or it could be having to read over their entire application, which should be pages long, their CVs or resumes that can be also pages and pages long, reviewing the questionnaires that they're looking to submit, and again, in that case, there's lots of questions back and forth between the reviewers. A lot of this is via email, so you know there's a little bit of a delay waiting for everybody to get back to each other. But in the event that we have something that's a big issue, we'll have a conference call and discuss it and kind of hash it out and make a decision right there. But basically, the reviewers answered a series of questions that answer whether this topic is a fit for the foundation goals. Does it meet the needs of our kids? And are the researchers, literally, are they moral enough without any conflicts of interest that we want to allow them access to our kids' information? That said, that conflict of interest can also be on our part too. For example, if our child, or using me as an example, if my child is part of a current study for a certain researcher and that certain researcher shows up in my email box, I have to recuse myself, because it would not be in, you know, I'm already kind of in that person's favor anyway, so I need to not answer any questions on their behalf, other than anything more substantial than a level 1 or just basic clean data access.
Great. And so you mentioned, and I know Rebecca had also mentioned, what researchers have to submit to get on your radar. And it sounds like there's a lot of vetting that goes on before the foundation even gets it. So things like funders and institutions have to make sure that they're vetting. One example being an IRB. So people who are not research focused, IRB is an institutional review board, which is an ethics review of the study. So it sounds like that all happens even before you get to it, and then you have your own review. Does that sound right?
Yes, correct.
Great. So the other thing that seems to be a pattern here that Rebecca mentioned is kind of the value in this being a patient and family run registry and system. What do you think is the value of being a parent on this committee?
Fundamentally, we have a vested interest. These are our most important assets, and these are our most important goals in our life. Make sure that our kids get the attention and the research and the results and the outcomes that they need. So having a direct input on the research topics regarding that information that we've already shared about our kids, and then the outcomes that are produced from mining that information is extremely important. And also, studying our kids and our lives in general. It's something that where there's the confidentiality of it, we want the researchers to know a lot of the detail that we live with so that they can take that information and make better decisions and make better research and make better discoveries on our behalf. I think another reason that it's valuable to have parents on the committee is that we parents of special needs kids and rare disease, we lost our rose-colored glasses a long time ago. We have a better in touch with reality ability. And as we age into our roles as parents of these kids, we become more objective and more seasoned and can make better decisions about the direction that the research should take on our behalfs.
That's a great answer. Thank you. And the last question I have before we open this up is, what have you enjoyed most about being a reviewer?
It's been extremely enlightening learning just how much data is in the registry, as well as about how well our kids' data is protected. It's shocking, and I'm very, very thankful for that. The registry developers and committee has always been really conservative on that front, and it serves the foundation as well as the researchers requesting the access quite well. What I have enjoyed most is on the more detailed requests that we get, there's only been a couple that I've actually had to spend more than just a few minutes and like hours reading. One example that I have to share is a relatively young person had a CV that was 20 pages long. And at first I laughed because I thought, being in the professional environment, if I saw a 20-page resume come across my desk, it's going in the trash. I don't have time to read that. But this person, it was very legitimate. This person honestly had 20 pages worth of work that they had done, and I kept thinking, oh my gosh, when does this person sleep? But that was the most I can't think of the word I'm looking for right now, but the biggest and the most impressive one that I saw was 20 pages. But learning about all these people that are doing the research for our kids is pretty fun, and it's pretty incredible.
Right. That's great. So thank you so much. We have a couple of questions coming in. So let's get started from the top. So questions open to either of our panelists. The first one, Rebecca, you mentioned consent and making sure to get that done. How often does consent need to be updated?
That's a really good question. So really only once right now. So when the registry very first opened in 2011, we had one consent form. And then in 2014, when the PMSDN was created, we had realized that this was a level or a type of data sharing that was different than what people had already agreed to. And we didn't feel like the questions you answered when we said, how do you want us to use your data? Those questions really didn't cover the PMSDN sufficiently enough. And it would not have been accurate or fair or ethical to just assume that if you had answered yes to data sharing there, that would apply to this specific situation. And I know we didn't talk in detail or really at all about the PMSDN today, because that's a whole other webinar. But so what I'm trying to get at is that we created a new consent form. We started over, and that's when we posted that on in July of 2014, right before that conference. We posted it on the registry platform, and it meant anyone who was already a member of the registry or anyone who joined after that had to fill out the new consent form. And so really it's just that one time. It's a big effort, and obviously it's taken us now going into 4 years and not everybody has reconsented. And so we try not to do that unless we absolutely have to. In terms of creating a new consent form. So you only have to do it once, but that's a little bit of the background about why we had you reconsent in the first place. And it's only that one time. But I can't promise it won't happen in the future, but it's not in the foreseeable future, and we do try to avoid it.
Right, sounds good. Next question could be for either of you. Our researchers that we know, so researchers that have been at our conference presented, we have a relationship with, do they get any different treatment than other researchers who are requesting information? I mean, we know them so well. Do they get any preferential treatment?
We have one process, and everyone goes through the same process. And so it is a level playing field. But there are, as Kim talked about actually as well, like, there are situations where maybe Megan responds to the other reviewers and says, hey guys, just as some background information, this is actually somebody we worked with in the past. And so she can provide a layer of context and depth maybe for that case of how we've talked to them before, how we've interacted before. We know them well. We know they're a ethical person of high quality, and their research is of high quality. And so there's a layer of depth there, but they don't get a layer of special treatment per se.
Great. And Kim, did you have something to add about that?
I just that it makes it a little bit easier in the vetting process when you know them, and when somebody else in the group knows them, and they can introduce you or give you background information on them that you wouldn't be able to find if you Googled them or something like that. But yeah, they don't get preferential treatment at all.
So I know that we're out of time. I wanted to ask one more question that came in. Be respectful of everyone's time. But there was about a year and a half ago, there were a group of families that participated in the CareSync pilot project, which collected medical records. Rebecca, you may have some say in this. How was that data used in, does that overlap with this, or really how was that information used? And I'm happy to step in if you start.
Sure. Actually, I mean, I can give the brief version. So that data was actually fed into the PMSDN, which again, we didn't talk about today. So that was a medical records collection that happened in parallel to the attachments that you all upload to your registry profile. And so those are sort of thinking about data collection. Those are two sources of medical records to be collected. CareSource was this one big project we did in the past, and then these attachments is another way to collect those records. And those are used in the PMSDN for a natural language processing system where we have a program that can basically the computer reads that PDF and extracts that knowledge from those medical records and is able to create a searchable database by pulling out that knowledge. So we don't have to type it in, or you don't have to type it in. And so that's where those medical records went. But Jackie ran that program, so she's far more knowledgeable than I on the details.
Yeah, no, I think you did a good job of summarizing that. That information is considered part of your registry data in your registry home, but it doesn't live there since it's kind of a different format. But that is being used in the PMSDN, which is also being slowly rolled out among research for kind of a deeper dive of data. So for families that are interested in providing more than just the questionnaires and the genetic reports, we are, able to work with you to provide clinical notes that could go in. It's just not something that goes into the registry. So if that's something that you want to continue to add, or if you are new to this and you have questions and want to add, please reach out to us and we can talk about that offline. So thank you so much to families that were able to listen in. This is going to get posted. So hopefully this can live on and you can continue to ask questions. Thank you to Rebecca and Kim. You both are doing really amazing, exciting work, and it's great to hear about it, even though as things kind of move on, things change, and we want to promote the research. So it's very exciting for you guys to be on the forefront of that. So thank you so much. If you all could take a few minutes over the next day or so to fill out an evaluation that will be emailed to you after, that would be great. And again, reach out to me if you have questions for me, Kim, or Rebecca that you want communicated. So thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.